For more on the landmark deals on methane and climate change solutions, let's bring in Barry Rabe. He's a professor of environmental policy at the University of Michigan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So first, I'd like you to talk generally about just how big of a problem methane emissions are in terms of climate change.
Methane has been often overlooked in climate discussions in recent decades, in part because of the huge role that carbon dioxide plays. But the role of methane has gained increasing recognition, particularly in the last few years, both because of its sheer volume, but also because of its very intensive impact in the atmosphere a few decades after release. Carbon lasts much longer, but an equivalent amount of methane does a lot more concentrated damage in the nearer term. And as we've begun to become more concerned in the near term about major changes in temperature and with it larger concerns about climate change, methane seems to be a so-called low-hanging fruit that if we were to address it now, we might reap some serious dividends over the next few decades beyond the larger kinds of calculations that we usually make when we think about climate change. So it has indeed become a major and a growing consideration, including its reflection in the discussions that just took place in Scotland at the international conference.
So then what role does livestock play in those emissions, especially as more of the world enter the middle class and in turn want to eat more beef?
Livestock and agriculture are large. I tend to think of methane as coming from three large buckets. A big one is energy production. Gas, coal, oil, leaks of methane that begin to emerge. A smaller bucket involves landfills, waste treatment systems, wastewater treatments. But another big one, roughly about as big as the energy sector, is the combination of agriculture and the way in which we do it around the world, but also livestock, as you mentioned, in particular cows, cattle, and pigs. Because of their stomachs, because of their diet, because of the way that they are produced and cultivated, that's a huge portion of this larger problem of methane.
And we did see that research there from the University of New Hampshire and other places trying to limit methane emissions, trying things, as we saw in that package about seaweed. What success have you seen in some of these innovations, and are you seeing it make a difference?
I would say really with livestock issues, we're in an early stage of experimentation rather than one where we have proven performance over a longer period of time. You know, as the seaweed discussion that you just screened shows, this is certainly promising, and there's research going on in the U.S. and around the world about seaweed, but other kinds of dietary adjustments that might be made. There's reason to be enthusiastic. There are a lot of unanswered questions, though, in terms of how long does this impact and effect last, and how significant ultimately will it be on a more global scale. It hasn't been fully tested yet, along with some of these other things, but it's a significant one. Obviously, a challenge here, and it's reflected in your question, is our sheer reliance on beef and pork and dairy as such central components to our diet. There is growing discussion in many circles of how possible might it be to reduce the consumption of those items and move to other animal proteins, fish and chicken, or vegetable sources. And really, just like weaning ourselves off of fossil fuel, probably the best serious strategy here longer term isn't just changing diets of cattle, but thinking about how we reduce our dependence on these animal sources, because these particular animals, given the unique nature of their stomachs and all other aspects of their internal plumbing system, are really very, very substantial methane contributors.
So then, given that holistic approach you mentioned, that not just in what we feed the animals, but how we think about what we feed ourselves, we did see at the recently concluded COP26, the U.S. and the EU announcing this global methane pledge, which aims to limit methane emissions by 30% by 2030, compared with 2020 levels, as we saw more than 100 countries signed on to. What are your thoughts on these commitments on methane and some of the sticking points there might be in really implementing them?
I do think one of the most exciting developments in global climate policy in recent years has been this launch of a global methane challenge, really launched initially by President Biden just weeks ago, proposing a 30% reduction across all of those sources that we were just discussing by the end of this decade. And the surprising development that over 100 countries already have signed on. Of course, the challenge is, as we find in many areas of climate policy, it's one thing to make a pledge or set a goal or make a pronouncement. It's quite another to deliver on that and actually achieve these reductions. I tend to think of all the sectors we were just discussing. One area where we may be quite poised to advance, maybe less livestock and agriculture, but the energy side, oil and gas in particular. Here there are many technologies available to literally capture gas that is being flared or vented, methane lost into the atmosphere, and there are economic reasons to do this. Methane reduced in those sectors is purely a constituent piece of natural gas. It is a fuel. And so if you're losing that type of energy to the atmosphere, you're wasting a natural resource that once it is lost is gone forever. So there's monetary value in using and deploying some of these technologies. So I actually welcome this global challenge. I think it will be very difficult, as in any arena of climate policy,
Right.
to organize this, to implement it, and make it work. But I think in particular, the energy sector is quite promising.